Now, imagine a man so dangerous, so unpredictable, that the US government built an entire prison wing just to keep him away from everyone else. A man who spent 36 years in nonstop solitary confinement, longer than anyone in American history. This is the true story of Thomas Silverstein, the most isolated man in America, and the chilling secrets hidden inside ADX Florence. What pushed him into total isolation, and what happened to a mind left completely alone. Thomas Edward Silverstein didn't enter the world as a symbol of terror. Like most stories that later twist into darkness, his began quietly, October 4, 1952 in Long Beach, California. His childhood wasn't the kind written into textbooks or whispered about in prison yards. It was far more ordinary on the surface, yet fractured underneath. A home marked by instability, constant moves, and an early sense that he didn't quite belong anywhere. He didn't take his biological father's last name. Instead, he carried the name of his adoptive father, Thomas Conway, a man who provided structure but not warmth. His mother, Virginia, loved him, but she struggled to manage the moods and conflicts raging inside her young son. By the time he entered adolescence, Silverstein had developed a familiar pattern. Rules didn't apply to him, authority didn't impress him, and violence, when it came, never seemed to surprise him. School became optional. Street life became routine. Petty crimes escalated into burglaries, and by 17 he had already stepped into the criminal justice system. But it was 1971 that defined the trajectory of the rest of his life. After a string of armed robberies, Thomas was sentenced to federal prison. He was 19, too young to know what was coming, too angry to care. Prison didn't break him. It shaped him. In the early 1970s, the U.S. federal prison system was a battleground. Racial tension seethed in every cell block, gangs ruled the corridors, violence was currency. Young, impressionable, and desperate to survive, Silverstein aligned himself with the Aryan Brotherhood, not out of ideology but survival. Once you joined, you didn't walk away. He quickly developed a reputation, quiet, controlled, but willing to take things to a level others wouldn't. And in prison, reputation was everything. But the defining moment, the one that would later sentence him to a lifetime of isolation, began in 1980 at USP Leavenworth. Silverstein was accused of murdering an inmate named Danny Atwell, allegedly at the orders of the Aryan Brotherhood. Silverstein denied it. Other inmates claimed the evidence was weak. But the federal system, eager to crack down on gang killings, hit him with a life sentence. And that was the moment all future walls began closing in. 2 years later, he was transferred to USP Marion, the most violent federal prison in America at the time. If Leavenworth was dangerous, Marion was a war zone. Inmates often described it as a cage inside a cage, and within weeks, Silverstein's name was already circulating in staff briefings. He had been labeled a high-risk gang member, a potential threat. Guards watched him closely. Other inmates watched him even more closely. And inside Silverstein's mind, walls he never talked about began stacking themselves. He later said he felt singled out, hunted, treated differently. Whether that was paranoia or reality is still debated, but in Marion, perception often became prophecy. A feud with a correctional officer named Merle Clutts began to simmer, a feud that would redefine American prison policy forever. Silverstein claimed Clutts harassed him relentlessly. Guards said Silverstein was manipulative, dangerous, and constantly pushing boundaries. Both sides agreed on only one thing: the hatred between them was mutual and growing. Soon, Marion would explode into violence so shocking, the federal government would redesign how it handled dangerous inmates. Solitary confinement, as we know it today, would evolve from what happened next. And Thomas Silverstein was standing in the eye of the storm. Inside the steel labyrinth of USP Marion, tension didn't just hang in the air, it coiled. The place was a pressure cooker, and every officer, every inmate, every routine movement felt like it could ignite something explosive. But even in a prison built for the hardest men in the federal system, one rivalry became legendary: Thomas Silverstein versus Officer Merle Clutts. Clutts wasn't a rookie. He'd worked Marion's toughest tiers for years and believed deeply in discipline. He saw inmates like Silverstein, gang-tied, defiant, unpredictable, as threats that had to be controlled with an iron grip. By contrast, Silverstein felt targeted. He claimed Clutts tampered with his mail, trashed his art supplies, and encouraged other officers to break him. Guards denied it. Inmates whispered otherwise. But the truth, like always, lived somewhere in the tension between those walls. It didn't help that Silverstein had already been labeled one of the Aryan Brotherhood's most dangerous soldiers. Whether he earned that reputation or prison politics stapled it onto him didn't matter. What mattered was that Clutts treated him like a fuse waiting to ignite. And something inside Silverstein hated that kind of attention. By 1983, whatever fragile balance they'd once had was gone. Silverstein claimed Clutts constantly provoked him, taunting him during counts, disrupting his routines, scrutinizing every interaction. Even other inmates began to notice the way these two locked eyes from opposite ends of a tier. Some said Clutts was trying to stop Silverstein from gaining influence in Marion. Others said Silverstein was simply too defiant, too proud, too unwilling to submit. Regardless of motive, both men felt backed into a corner, and corners make people dangerous. The breaking point arrived on October 22, 1983. Silverstein was being escorted by two guards for a routine movement. He wasn't shackled, a detail that later sparked heavy criticism. According to official reports, the moment he spotted Clutts at the far end of the corridor, something snapped. Silverstein broke free from the escorting officers and bolted toward Clutts. Inmates later said it looked like a man possessed. Officers said it was pure predatory violence. Using a homemade sharpened metal weapon, a shank, smuggled into the unit, Silverstein attacked Officer Clutts with ferocity that horrified even hardened Marion staff. The assault was swift, brutal, and fatal. Guard witnesses said it happened so fast they were stunned into silence before rushing in. By the time they pulled Silverstein away, Clutts was gone. There was no doubt who did it. Silverstein didn't deny it. He didn't run. He didn't plea. He quietly surrendered and later said, "I was pushed too far." But the federal government wasn't interested in motives. They were interested in consequences. The murder sent shockwaves through the entire Bureau of Prisons. Killing an officer inside a maximum security facility wasn't just rare. It was the kind of incident that made administrators question whether the system was even capable of containing certain individuals. Marion went into emergency lockdown almost instantly. The entire federal prison system reeled. But the story didn't stop with Clutts. Just hours later, in an unrelated but eerily timed incident, another Aryan Brotherhood member named Clayton Fountain murdered another correctional officer, Robert Hoffman. Two officers killed in the same prison, in the same 24 hours, it was unprecedented. The Bureau of Prisons realized something undeniable: the old system wasn't enough. Something new had to be created. Silverstein wasn't sent to a courtroom. He wasn't given another trial. Instead, the punishment was administrative and absolute. A no human contact order, the first of its kind. No cellmate. No recreation with others. No jobs. No interaction with staff beyond absolute necessities. And no chance of leaving solitary. Ever. Officials didn't mince words. They said it aloud. This man is too dangerous to be around any other person. They isolated him inside a specially modified cell in Marion, a prototype of what solitary confinement would become. Steel bars were replaced with a solid steel door. Windows were frosted. Lights were controlled externally. Every inch of the environment was designed to keep one man from touching, speaking to, or even seeing another. For the first time, the United States created true long-term isolation, and Thomas Silverstein became its test subject. But the story doesn't end there. Not even close. Because what happened over the next decades, the psychological decay, the lawsuits, the creation of ADX Florence itself, would cement his status not just as an inmate, but as an icon of the prison system's darkest corner. His name became a blueprint for maximum isolation. And his life became an experiment the world still debates today. When the door slammed shut on Thomas Silverstein's modified isolation cell at USP Marion, a new kind of punishment began in America, one not written in the sentencing documents of any court. It wasn't a judge who condemned him to it. It wasn't a jury. It was the federal prison system itself, declaring that one man was too dangerous to exist anywhere but inside a box built specifically to contain him. And that box became his entire universe. Silverstein later described it as a place built to bury a man alive. Every detail of his new environment was engineered to control him. His cell measured roughly 7 by 12 feet, about the size of a walk-in closet. The door was a solid slab of steel with only a narrow food slot. The walls were plain, unpainted, and cold. His bed was a concrete platform with a thin mattress. His toilet and sink were steel, bolted into place. There was no view of the outside world. The small window that existed had been frosted so he couldn't see past the glare of light. He had no cellmate. No yard time with other inmates. No conversations. No footsteps approaching for a friendly chat. The guards spoke to him only when absolutely necessary, and even then their words were clipped, procedural. The no human contact designation wasn't a nickname, it was literal policy. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The silence became a second skin, and the monotony carved sharp edges into his mind. Humans aren't built to live without sound or connection. In isolation, the mind doesn't rest. It reaches, it searches, and when it finds nothing, it starts turning inward. Prison psychologists call it solitary syndrome. Silverstein called it a slow death. He once described waking up confused, unable to tell if he'd been asleep or simply staring at the walls for hours. Without clocks, natural light, or stimulation, time lost its meaning. Meals arrived through the slot. Mail, when it wasn't restricted, was censored heavily. His exercise yard was a dog cage, outside, barely large enough to walk in a circle. Sometimes he was escorted there. Sometimes weeks passed with no yard time at all. And always the lights buzzed. In the early years he fought the confinement. He filed grievances, wrote letters, and protested the restrictions. But the Bureau of Prisons saw every complaint as confirmation that isolation was necessary. They believed he was a mastermind of Aryan Brotherhood operations. They feared he could inspire violence even behind bars. It didn't matter that Silverstein later claimed he'd cut ties with the gang. Once labeled, always labeled. But the system didn't just isolate him physically, it isolated him legally. His no human contact status wasn't an official punishment that could be appealed. It wasn't a sentence he could reduce for good behavior. There was no path out. It was an administrative designation, meaning prison officials could extend it indefinitely. And they did. In 1983, when the policy began, no prison official thought it would last decades. They believed it would manage an immediate crisis. Instead, it evolved into a life sentence of silence. To survive, Silverstein turned inward. He developed a routine built around small rituals: drawing, meditating, writing letters, working out in the confined space. He tried to keep his mind sharp, but the isolation was a constant predator. He reported hallucinations, hearing footsteps that weren't there, voices that weren't real, even seeing movement in the edges of his vision. Yet despite the deterioration, he held on to one thing: a belief that he had been unfairly buried. He didn't deny the violence he committed. He denied the idea that the rest of his life needed to be erased because of it. In one letter he wrote, "I am a man, not a ghost. But they are trying to make me disappear." His story began circulating among civil rights activists and lawyers who argued that long-term solitary confinement was a form of psychological torture. They cited medical studies showing that isolation altered brain chemistry, triggered psychosis, and caused irreversible mental harm. Silverstein became the face of that debate, a man who had committed horrific violence, yet whose punishment pushed the boundaries of what a society should do with its most dangerous members. Inside Marion, staff quietly referred to his cell as Silverstein's tomb. And in many ways that's what it was becoming. But the most secure cell in Marion was only a temporary solution. The federal government didn't just want to isolate Silverstein, they wanted to design a place where someone like him could never again threaten staff or inmates. This meant building an entirely new prison. A prison unlike anything America had ever seen. A fortress engineered specifically for men like Thomas Silverstein. And its name was ADX Florence. By the late 1980s, the Bureau of Prisons had a problem they didn't want to admit out loud: they were outmatched. The federal system was dealing with a generation of inmates who operated like military units, violent prison gangs, ideological extremists, and individuals who could orchestrate chaos from inside a cement box. And at the center of every internal discussion, every emergency meeting, every "how do we control the uncontrollable?" debate stood one name: Thomas Silverstein. Marion had gone from a high-security prison to a full lockdown institution because of Silverstein and Clayton Fountain. Staff morale was crumbling. Violence kept spreading. The old architecture simply wasn't designed for men the government believed could turn a paperclip into a threat. So the Bureau of Prisons made a decision. If they couldn't control these inmates inside existing facilities, they would create a place specifically for them. A fortress that didn't just contain violence but prevented it entirely. This idea evolved into something unprecedented: the first supermax prison in the United States. Its name would be United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum, but the world would come to know it as ADX Florence. And it wasn't built to reform or rehabilitate. It was built to erase danger, to silence, to isolate, to create the closest thing America had ever seen to a human vault. And unofficially, in the early planning documents, in the whispers among administrators, in the design meetings held behind thick doors, everyone knew the same truth. They were building ADX with Thomas Silverstein in mind. Construction began in the high desert of Colorado in the early 1990s, A place chosen because of its remoteness, its harsh landscape, and the fact that escape would be nearly impossible. The surrounding area was already known as America's Alcatraz of the Rockies, home to multiple federal prisons. ADX Florence would become the crown jewel, or the crown cage. The architecture was meticulous, weaponized, psychological. Every angle, every hallway, every piece of reinforced steel was designed with violent offenders in mind. Cells were poured from a single mold of concrete. Doors were solid metal. Windows were narrow slits angled upward so inmates couldn't see the horizon, only sky. Movement was reduced to a science. Automated doors, zero unrestrained interactions, and corridors built to prevent ambushes. No corners. No blind spots. No moments of vulnerability for staff. No opportunities for inmates to touch another human being without a chain of authorization. Inside the administrative buildings, sketches of cell layouts circulated among officials, layouts that would later match the exact conditions of Silverstein's future home. The message was clear. Never again would an officer be murdered inside a federal prison. Never again would an inmate like Silverstein take advantage of a staffing routine, or a brief unshackled moment, or a miscommunication. If Marion was a cage inside a cage, ADX would be a prison inside a tomb. When ADX finally opened its gates in 1994, the press marveled at its design. Officials bragged about its control systems. Advocates warned it was a clean version of hell. But across the country, in a no-contact cell in Marion, Thomas Silverstein received the news through a guard's offhand comment. "They just built a place for men like you." He didn't know it yet, and neither did the public. But Silverstein would eventually become ADX's most infamous resident, a man whose isolation cell would later be referred to by journalists as the box inside the box. For the Bureau of Prisons, ADX was the solution to decades of violence, escape attempts, and staff deaths. But for Silverstein, it represented something far darker. An upgraded coffin. He had already been in solitary for nearly a decade when ADX opened. His mental health was deteriorating. The world outside his cell had changed. New presidents, new laws, new wars, but he hadn't touched another human being or felt sunlight on his skin without a steel cage blocking it. Yet the government wasn't done with him. In 2005, after more than 20 years of total isolation, a decision was made to move him. Not to give him relief. Not to change his conditions. But to place him in the one facility built specifically so he could never harm anyone again. The transfer order was simple. The intent was unmistakable. Thomas Silverstein was going to ADX Florence. And what awaited him there would redefine the meaning of solitary confinement, not just for him but for the entire world watching. Because ADX wasn't designed to house people. It was designed to contain threats. And the man the government believed was their ultimate threat was finally coming home. On a cold morning in 2005, long before the sun broke across the Rockies, a convoy of unmarked vehicles moved through the desert toward a cluster of razor wire and concrete rising from the earth like a bunker left over from another era. This was ADX Florence, the supermax of supermaxes. A place inmates whispered about long before they ever saw it. A place guards described with equal parts pride and unease. A place built not for rehabilitation but containment. Locked inside one of those armored vehicles, shackled at wrists and ankles, sat Thomas Edward Silverstein. For more than 20 years he had lived inside a no-contact cell at Marion. The government had kept him buried, preserved in a vacuum of silence. But this transfer wasn't a promotion to a different environment. It was a refinement of his punishment. ADX was a machine designed to eliminate variables. A system built so airtight that, in theory, no inmate could ever harm a staff member again. The direct answer to the deaths of officers Clutts and Hoffman. As the convoy rolled to a stop, Silverstein stepped out onto the concrete, not to breathe free air, but to take his first steps toward the most technologically secure isolation unit ever created in the United States. His escort team surrounded him like a human wall. No chances were taken. No mistakes allowed. A man who had spent decades alone was still treated as if he might explode into violence at any moment. Inside ADX, the intake process was clinical. Not cruel, not emotional, procedural. Staff spoke in short commands. Paperwork already contained every detail of his life. Crimes, disciplinary history, psychological evaluations, warnings, risk factors. Silverstein wasn't transferring to a new prison. He was being absorbed into a design that anticipated him before he arrived. From the central corridor, he was guided through a maze of steel and concrete. Heavy doors slid open electronically, closing behind him with the unmistakable sound of weight meeting weight. He passed through the facility like a ghost walking backward through his own legacy. The silent hum of security systems, the cameras, the motion sensors, the narrow air ducts, all of it designed for men just like him. And then the escort stopped. They stood at the entrance of the most secure range in the prison, Range 13. To the average observer, Range 13 was just a hallway. To those who worked there, it was something else entirely, a vault for the most dangerous or most unmanageable inmates in the federal system. The world rarely saw it. Journalists begged for access and were denied. Even some staff members were kept out unless necessary. It contained only a handful of cells. And one of them would become Silverstein's final home. The door opened, and Silverstein stepped into a space engineered around the lessons learned from Marion. The cell was small, poured from solid concrete. The bed, desk, and stool were all part of the same block. No loose parts, nothing that could be broken off. The toilet and sink were stainless steel, separated by security plumbing. The lighting was controlled externally, timed, regulated. A slot for food. A slit of a window angled upward, allowing sunlight but denying a view of anything recognizable. This wasn't solitary confinement. This was environmental total control. Even in Marion, Silverstein had some small freedoms. The ability to draw, to paint, to write letters without people monitoring each sentence. At ADX, every movement, every piece of mail, every item in his possession was scrutinized with microscopic detail. His recreation took place in an indoor cage, a concrete pen with a mesh ceiling that allowed a patch of sky but not much else. He was moved there alone. Always alone. For most inmates, ADX had a step-down program, a system that allowed them to advance to less restrictive units through good behavior. Many did. Most tried. Some even succeeded. But tucked into Silverstein's intake packet were two words that made that entire system irrelevant. No. Progression. He wasn't there to be rehabilitated or reformed. He was there to be contained until he died. No interaction. No programs. No movement. No path out. His arrival was noted, documented, and filed away. For journalists, he became the most isolated man in America. For prison officials, he remained a symbol, proof that the system remembered its dead. For other inmates, he was a legend living behind a door they'd never see. And for Silverstein himself? He described ADX as burial alive in a concrete coffin. Yet even inside this tomb he tried to keep parts of himself alive. He continued drawing, although his supplies were restricted. He kept exercising. He maintained correspondence with a small circle of supporters who saw him as a tragic figure. A man punished not just for what he'd done but for what he symbolized. Years passed. Seasons changed above the desert he could never see. The world outside shifted faster than he could mentally track. The federal system continued evolving. But inside ADX his routine never changed. He lived in a place built around the idea that humans could be contained at a level deeper than any prison before it. He once wrote, "I haven't touched another human being since 1983. Can you imagine what that does to a person?" Most people couldn't. But Silverstein lived it, day after day, year after year. And the psychological cost, the slow erosion of identity, was beginning to show in ways the Bureau of Prisons didn't want to publicly acknowledge. Because even a man locked in a concrete box for decades still has a mind, still has thoughts, still has breaking points. In the end, Thomas Silverstein's story wasn't just about one man, or one crime, or even one prison. It became a test of how far a society is willing to go when fear collides with justice. For more than 3 decades he lived in a world without touch, without conversation, without a single moment of shared humanity. Whether you see him as a monster shaped by violence, or a man destroyed by isolation, his life forced the world to confront an uncomfortable question. How much punishment is too much? Even inside the most secure walls in America, Silverstein's existence remained a reminder that prisons don't just hold bodies, they hold stories. Stories about choices, environments, consequences, and the thin line between justice and cruelty. If this deep dive opened your eyes, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. More untold stories are coming. Stories buried in files, locked behind steel doors, and whispered through the prison system's darkest corridors. Thanks for watching. And remember, in places built to make people disappear, the truth still finds its way out.